Alright, in this lesson we're going to go over the Unit 4 concept of a variable. A variable is an extremely important concept in computer programming. In fact, variables pretty much make up the majority of programming. It's a concept that you need to get down pat as soon as possible. If you can master how to use a variable, how to update it, how to display a variable, how to take inputs to a variable, then that'll really help shape how you view variables moving forward. One of the best ways to kind of view a variable is to view a variable as it is in mathematics or in your algebra class. So, for example, if we have this Word document here, and here you can see I have the classic x and y as our variables. So, for example, x right here is x equals 4, and then y equals 7. And so what would happen is, if I were to have another variable called z, I could set z equal to x plus y. And as a variable, the way you want to think about a variable is a variable just holds the value of some number or a thing or string or whatever that value happens to be. So x is a variable that holds the value 4, y is a variable that holds the value 7, and then z is a variable that holds the value of x plus y. And so if you were to follow this equation all the way through, we would see that z is actually equal to 11. That's just some basic mathematics there. Using our variables, right? So z is equal to x plus y, and x plus y is a 4 plus 7. Now, if we want to look at it in programming, it's going to be a little bit different. So let's look at it from a programming standpoint. Here we have our form in Visual Studio once again, and you can see here that we also have our button with a label. All right, so again, pretty straightforward. And this time we want to kind of look at the idea of variables. What are variables, kind of how they work, and kind of review this lesson from Unit 4. So I'm going to go and double click on my button. It's going to create a private sub here. Now, one of the key things about variables is you have to declare a variable before you can use it. All right, so sort of like how Michael Scott in The Office, remember when he had to declare bankruptcy, right? We want to declare a variable before we can actually use that variable. All right, so we want to declare our variables generally right here. This space right here between the public class form1 and the private sub button one click. We want to declare our variables here because this allows us to use our variables throughout the entire program. Now remember our naming convention for a variable. Right? So our naming convention for a variable in Visual Basic is dim, and then whatever the variable name is as the data type. So for sake of argument, I'm going to call this random variable. Again, you can call your variable whatever you want. And then as a data type, right? And this one I want to actually call a string. I want to call this one a string. Now, remember in programming there are different variable types. You have your integers, your doubles. All right, I'll write those in comments real quick. So you have your integers, your doubles. It's just double, not doubles. Your decimals, characters or chars, a string, a boolean, all right, so on and so forth. And the key to remember is when you declare a variable as a specific variable type, you can only use it as that type. All right, and as sort of review, you should remember that our integer, our double, and our decimal variable types are numbers. This is if you're going to add, subtract, multiply, or do something with numbers, right? That would be your integer, double, and decimal variable types. Your char is a letter, so like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, just a single individual letter. Your string is your most common text. So before, from Unit 3, you remember when we put things in quotation marks, and it turned the color of the text red. When the color of your text is red, that means that it's a string value. It's a text value. And then Boolean is a true or a false. So you will use the keyword true or you use the keyword false. Now here's an important rule to remember. Your strings can be numbers. In other words, you can have a number that's actually a string. For example, you could have maybe a username like Mike123, and that could be a string value. In other words, a text value. You don't add it, you don't subtract it, but notice how you have numbers in it. All right. On the other hand, your numbers, your integers, your doubles, and your decimals cannot be a string. All right, that makes sense. You cannot add string values. So, for example, you cannot add the word Bob, or you cannot multiply the word cat. Right? They're not really mathematical numbers. So, therefore, if your variable is a number, then it cannot take in a string value. However, if your variable is a string, then it can take in a number value. All right. So let's write a program and let's kind of see how variables work. So remember, right here I've already declared a variable, dim. Remember our keyword dim on the front. Variable name, whatever the name of the variable is. Remember, ours is called random variable as string. So this means that this is a string variable. It can only accept string values. All right. Now, remember, this variable right now does not have an initial value. I have not given it an initial value. So what this means is that this variable has an initial value of null. Remember, that's a null. Remember, null legitimately means there's no value there. All right, it's different from 0. It's different from a blank value. Now, remember, we talked about in class, null values can give you some problems. So here, I want to set this equal to open close quotation marks. This way, it gets a blank value. All right. Now, in our button, what we want to do is we want to have coding to where when I click on this button, it's going to update this label with maybe the name of the person, with the name of the variable. All right, so what we want to do is let's write some coding and let's actually put a value into our variable. So again, here's our variable. Notice how our variable doesn't have a value right now, right? It has a blank value. So I want to put a value into my variable. And so remember, this is a string variable. So if this is a string variable, the value that goes into my variable must be in quotation marks because it's a string value. So let's say I want to put the name Mark. All right, so I want to put the name Mark into my variable. So notice how here I have my variable on the left-hand side of the equal sign. So this variable is now equal to Mark. And remember, this is in a private sub button 1. So this means whenever I click on the button, this will happen, right? And then I want to display this variable in the label. So here I'll write label1.text, all right, just like we did before in unit 3. All right, and here we're going to say your name is, all right, again, notice how this is also in quotation marks. I mean, this is also a string value, all right? Now, if you remember from our lecture, we talked about how we can also input variables into our output. Again, remember the label is a output. So it's going to output something to the user. In order to do that, we have to use this and symbol here. All right, so here we already have some sort of value, some string value here. And so because we want to put a variable after it, we have to tell the computer, hey, something is going to go in between this string value and then the variable. That's going to be this little ampersand. Well, it's called a concatenation. All right, and now we're going to put our variable here. So what this does is it's going to display your name is, and then this and symbol, the little ampersand or concatenation, tells the computer, hey, something is coming. And what's coming, it could be another string value, it could be a variable like we have here. All right, and so let's run it and let's kind of see what happens with this program here. All right, so here I hit my start button. Let's bring my program down. All right, so here I have my form 1, my button, and my label. So again, here I have coding to where when I click on the button, again, this is what the private sub means. When I click on this button, first I'm going to fill this variable with Mark, and then I'm going to display your name is, and then the name Mark. All right, or what should be Mark in there. So let's click on button 1. Let's see if that happens. And there we go. All right, that should be very straightforward, and you can kind of see how that works through the coding itself. Let's change it up. Let's say I want to use maybe some numbers instead. So let me get rid of this coding here for the random variable with Mark. All right, and let's keep my random variable up here, and let's make another one called random variable 2 as this time we're going to make these integer values. All right, so let's make these both integers. We want to make some numbers this time. Now here you can see I have my random numbers, again my random variable, same as before. But this time, notice how it's a integer. All right, I just changed the data type here. But notice how I still have it set equal to the double quotations. Is this going to work? And the answer is no, this will not work. And the reason this will not work is because this is a string value. Remember, the quotation marks indicate strings. So a string cannot go into a variable that's an integer. Instead, what you do is you set this equal to 0, and we do the same for this. All right, so this is now at an initial value of 0. Now let's say I want to actually set these values to something else. So what I'll do is I'll say random variable is equal to 5, and then for sake of argument, a random variable 2 actually is equal to 6. This time I'm actually going to set these two equal to a different number. Right? Now what I want to do is I want to output these numbers in my label again. So here I'm going to say my number 1 is, and this I'm going to say random variables. This is still good. Now let's say I want to go to the next line. All right, so remember, if I want to go to the next line, I still have to use that ampersand. Remember, the ampersand kind of splits up what's actually in the output. So here I'm putting ampersand between my random variable, and now I want to go to the next line of the label. And here we'll use the keyword VB new line, which is built into Visual Basic to move on to the next line. And we're going to write another text here. So we'll say your number 2 is, and then here we'll say, and this will be our random number 2. All right, so hopefully you can see that here. It should be pretty straightforward. All right, again, this is all in our label1.text. Your number 1 is, and then random number, just like before, and the VB new line, which will jump into the next line, and then you can see the ampersand again. Your number 2 is, and then the random number 2. So if we run this program, what we should see is when I click on the button 1, label 1 should display your number 1 is 5. On the second line, it should say your number 2 is 6. All right, let's click the button to see if that works. Fantastic. And you can see that updates immediately. And again, all we're doing here is we're declaring a variable, all right, and then we're setting a different value to the variable inside our program, and then we're outputting that variable in a label. All right. So what I recommend is you go through and you practice this on your own, see the difference between a number, like an integer, a double, or a decimal, and then see the difference between a character or string or boolean. You'll notice some differences in how those variables are being used.